It began so quietly I almost didn't notice. A pause in the way Daniel said goodnight. The way his hand brushed mine in passing, not holding but merely touching like a shadow of touch, fading before it truly landed. There was no great fight, no slammed doors or tears dried on pillows. Only a creeping stillness, as if our lives had settled into a kind of sleepwalk. Our house was still full of the ordinary. The morning news murmured in the background while he brewed his coffee. He knew exactly how I liked mine, half a teaspoon of sugar, a whisper of cream. He never asked. He just made it that way, every morning. It should have made me feel known. Instead, it felt rehearsed. There is a certain kind of loneliness that grows in shared space. When love no longer echoes back but sinks, unreturned, into routine. Daniel and I had built a life out of small, consistent acts. We were reliable, each to the other. He paid the bills. I handled the garden. We visited his mother on Sundays. We remembered birthdays. On paper, we were steady, respectful, predictable. And yet, beneath the surface of that predictability, something in me had begun to shift. It wasn't dissatisfaction, not quite. More like restlessness, like an itch beneath the skin of my everyday. It was a Wednesday when I first saw him. Elias. That day, I had walked to the little bookstore 2 streets over, not for anything particular. I just needed the air. The owner had died the year before, and his nephew had taken over. A younger man, perhaps in his late 30s, quiet and composed, with eyes that seemed to read more than books. He asked if I needed help, his voice as gentle as the turning of a page. I remember saying no, then hesitating. I turned back, and he smiled, like he'd already known I would. There was no flirtation, nothing obvious, just a kind of attentiveness I hadn't felt in years. The kind that made you feel like your words were being held, not just heard. I told him I liked poetry, that I missed the way words used to make me feel. He handed me a copy of something obscure, the title worn soft by time. I opened to a random page and read a line aloud. I don't remember what it said, only the hush that fell after. He looked at me, and in that quiet, I remembered a part of myself I hadn't visited in a long time. That was all. Just a moment. I went home and made dinner. Daniel kissed my cheek, and we watched the evening news. The world spun on, unchanged. But inside me, something had shifted. Barely perceptible. Like the first leaf falling at the edge of summer. I went back the next week. Not because I needed another book. Not even because I meant to see him again. At least, that's what I told myself. But my feet carried me, almost without thought, to the narrow shop with its bell that rang like a secret. Elias was there, of course. He was cataloging new arrivals, fingers brushing over faded spines like one might touch a lover's skin, carefully, reverently. He looked up when I entered and smiled as though he'd been expecting me. I told him I was just browsing. He nodded and returned to his work, giving me space. But the air between us felt heavier than it had before, charged, like the seconds before a summer storm. I wandered the aisles, not seeing the books. I could feel him behind me, not watching exactly, just aware. There was a comfort in it. A quiet invitation. After some time, he walked over and placed a book in my hands. "You might like this," he said, his voice low. It was a collection of letters, written between 2 strangers who had once met on a train and then never again. They wrote to each other for years, never quite confessing what was truly between them. I flipped through the pages. The first line read, "I don't know why I'm writing to you, except that something in me refuses not to." I held it to my chest. He asked nothing of me that day. He let me leave without fanfare. But something had been passed between us, quiet and weightless and invisible to the eye. A thread, perhaps. One I would later follow without knowing I was following it. At home, Daniel asked how my day had been. "Fine," I said, placing the book on the nightstand. I went to the bookstore again. He nodded, not asking more. He trusted me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of guilt. Guilt is slow to arrive when you haven't yet broken anything. but because my mind was full of noise, of letters unwritten, of glances that lingered too long, of a man whose name I now repeated silently, like a prayer I hadn't meant to learn. Elias. I said it once into the dark, just to hear how it sounded. I dreamt of him that night. Not his body, not even his mouth. Just his eyes, and the way they had looked at me like I was a mystery still worth reading. In the morning, Daniel handed me my coffee, like always. But I didn't drink it. It tasted too much like yesterday. By the third visit, I had stopped pretending it was about the books. It was late October by then, and the days had shortened, the light slanting in through the shop's front windows like golden ribbons unraveling across the floor. There was warmth inside, not just the kind from the old radiator tucked near the poetry section, but something softer, subtler. A warmth that lived in the pauses between our sentences. Elias greeted me by name this time. He said it without hesitation, without the protective cloak of formality. Just Clara, like a note struck on a piano, simple and resonant. It lingered in the air longer than it should have. We talked about everything and nothing. The weather, the melancholy of autumn. He asked me if I believed people could change. I told him I used to, and he didn't ask why I had stopped. He just nodded, as if he already knew. There was a stillness between us again. But this one felt different than the quiet between Daniel and me. This one pulsed. When I left, he walked me to the door. Not because he had to, just because he did. His hand brushed mine, barely, but it lit something beneath my skin that traveled up my spine and stayed humming there for hours. That night, Daniel and I went to a dinner party. We laughed with friends, clinked glasses, smiled at stories we'd all heard before. From the outside, we looked like the same couple we'd always been. People complimented us. Said we were solid. Steady. Lucky. But I couldn't stop thinking about Elias's hand and the fact that, when Daniel laughed, I no longer felt compelled to laugh with him. Later, in bed, Daniel reached for me. It wasn't out of desire. It was a habit, almost, a ritual performed at the altar of routine. I let him, and I held my breath, and I counted the lines of light slipping in through the blinds until it was over. After, he turned away, already drifting into sleep. I stared at the ceiling and felt like I was floating above myself. That night, I dreamed again, this time not of Elias's eyes, but of his silence. The kind that doesn't ask, but waits. The kind that makes room for confession without demanding it. In the morning, I wrote him a note. Just one line. Somewhere between missing and wanting is where I find myself. I folded it, tucked it into the pages of the book he'd once given me, and left it on the return shelf at the bookstore. No name. No signature. Just that. A part of me hoped he wouldn't find it. But another part hoped he would, and know it was mine. I waited for nothing and everything. I told myself I wasn't going back. That I had said enough with that note, with that single, trembling sentence folded like a secret between paper. But words have a way of echoing in silence, and the longer I stayed away, the louder they became. Somewhere between missing and wanting. Daniel noticed I was quieter, maybe. Or maybe he didn't. He was deep in a work project, a budget review he mentioned over dinner. He spoke while chewing, pausing to sip his wine. I nodded at the right moments. I smiled. But my mind was elsewhere, tracing the curve of a letter in Elias's name, wondering if he had read what I left for him, and if he had understood. Then, one morning, a package arrived. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in careful, slanted ink. Inside was a book. The love letters of a Portuguese nun. Tucked between the pages was a single sheet of old stationery. He had written back. There is a kind of ache that doesn't hurt, it just waits. I have felt it too. If you ever need to speak, truly speak, you know where to find me. No signature. He hadn't needed one. I placed the letter back between the pages and held the book against my chest. The moment stretched long, delicate, fragile. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, with the wind softly urging me forward. The next day, I went to him. I won't describe how it happened. the hours we spent, the hush of breath, the folding of time. Some things lose their shape if made too plain. But I will say this, I was not the woman Daniel had kissed that morning before leaving for work. And I would never fully be her again. After, I sat in Elias's bookstore as the sky darkened. We said very little. He didn't ask me for promises. I didn't offer explanations. What passed between us was not bound in declarations, only in the knowing. When I returned home, Daniel was in the garden. He wore his old sweatshirt and was pruning the rose bushes before winter. He looked up and smiled. "You're late," he said. I was starting to worry. "I just needed to think," I replied. He nodded, accepting it without suspicion, without defense. I watched him go back to his work, steady hands, quiet focus. A man who had never meant to hurt me, a man I had once chosen. Inside, I placed the book on the shelf between travel guides we never used and cookbooks stained with time. I stood there, listening to the silence of the house. It no longer felt like a fog, but neither did it feel like clarity. Just quiet. I loved Daniel. I had loved Elias, too, or the part of me he had awakened. But love, I was learning, was not always a choice. And staying, that was even harder. Now I sit at the edge of the bed, my fingers resting on 2 phone numbers. One leads back to the life I've built, with all its familiar comforts and invisible cracks. The other leads into something unknown, possibly foolish, possibly real. I don't know where I'll go from here. I only know that the silence inside me has been replaced by a different sound. Not certainty, not peace, but a question, still waiting to be answered.